to notice a theme running through today's service because we're going to begin now by breathing. Breathe with me. Deep and slow. This morning we're talking about gun violence. It's not an easy topic at any time. For those of us who have been around for at least 5 years, it may be especially difficult right now, hard on the heels of the anniversary of the day we learned firsthand the ways that mass shootings tear the fabric of communities. And it was just over a year ago that we learned again the ways that suicide does the same. And our bodies remember, even when our conscious minds don't. As the anniversary of traumatic events approach, we might find ourselves feeling weepy, anxious, irritable, or fatigued. We might find it more difficult to concentrate. A lot of people describe just feeling off. It can be confusing and stressful. And yet, I've come to understand this phenomenon as a gift. With each anniversary, our bodies give us an invitation to revisit the trauma, which we might not want to do, but with each year we have a little more distance, a little more wisdom, which allows for a little more healing. Each anniversary becomes an opportunity for further metabolization and integration of the trauma. That said, as we move through this service, if you feel flooded, please take care of yourselves. I promise I won't be offended if you get up and leave. Go get yourself a drink of water. Take a brisk but maybe really careful walk around the block. Our lay pastoral ministers are on hand. They're the ones wearing the shiny stoles, the shiny and colorful stoles. If you need someone to talk to, make eye contact and they'll go out with you. And above all, breathe. Deep breathing is the simplest way to rebalance, to come back to ourselves and reclaim body and brain from those stress hormones caused by trauma. So breathe and know that you are loved and you are safe and you are held. Even the most difficult things are possible with compassion and companionship. Beloveds, the past couple weeks while I've been researching this sermon and digging through hundreds and hundreds of pages of studies and commentary, it's been really, really challenging. To be honest, if I didn't know that Pat had paid a lot of money for me to do this, I might have chickened out. So thank you, Pat, for reminding me that I can do hard things and that together we can do hard things. I had to keep reminding myself that sometimes at the end of a difficult process, there are gifts that you couldn't have imagined at the beginning. There were times I got so angry that I found myself shaking and needing to smash something. The endless cycle of tragedy, thoughts and prayers, and then partisan debate. The $9.6 million the NRA spent lobbying lawmakers in the last 2 years, almost twice what they spent in the 2 years before that. The sheer greed of the weapons industry, it all makes me see red, but I know that righteous anger, even righteous anger, doesn't support clear thinking. So, breathe, go for a hike, clear my head, circle back to it. There were times I fell into the trap of feeling scared. Maybe I should go get a gun. After all, there's talk of civil war. I found myself afraid that even doing this, speaking publicly on gun violence, would draw people with guns to this sacred space, the way there were 2 guys with assault rifles who stood across the street at the first public rally that I attended as your minister, a rally in support of common sense gun control. But fear is the mind killer. It isn't helpful. Breathe. Go throw the ball for the dog for a little while. Give her a belly rub. Make myself a cup of tea. Circle round, come back to it. Mostly what I felt, though, was this sense of heaviness, of dread. My heart hurt. Literally, I've been walking around with this ache in the center of my chest. I feel raw and sensitive and exposed and just so sad. So, breathe, cry, call a friend, hug my kids, look at the really cute pictures of my niece and nephew that my sister sends me every couple of days. And this was the pattern. I'd go in, I'd get activated in some way, I'd need to back away, I'd engage in the practices that help me feel safe, gather strength and courage, and circle back and go back in. And that's what it was like. Here's what I learned. While people love to blame violent video games, television shows, and movies for desensitizing potential shooters, turns out there's absolutely no evidence that there's a link between consumption of violent media and violent acts. Exposure to violent media doesn't predict crime or behavior, nor does it measurably increase violent tendencies. Another favorite theory is that acts of gun violence are a result of mental illness, and again, data does not support this conclusion. The rate of violence among those with mental illness and mental health diagnoses is lower than the rate of violence in the rest of society. The story that we tell ourselves that it's mental illness that's the problem is particularly corrosive because it adds to the stigma around mental illness, which means people don't get the help that they need. There is unquestionably a link between intimate partner violence and gun violence, domestic abuse and gun violence. In more than half of the mass shootings in the last 10 years, a current or former partner of the shooter was among the victims. More than half. We also know that kids who are bullied really are at increased risk for both violent acts against others and self-harm. To be specific, there was a study published by the University of Washington School of Public Health that found that adolescents who reported being bullied were almost twice as likely to also report that they had access to a gun. Mayan Simke's PhD, the lead author of the study, said, "The strength of the association between bullying and gun access is alarming. We're not sure why bullied students are more likely to report access to a gun, but we now know the risk is there and it is high." On a slightly less ominous note, one of my favorite studies that I found, it looked at urban violence. And it turns out that if you turn vacant lots into green space, it decreases the rate of violent crimes in neighborhoods. We know this. Beauty, nature, space to breathe, these are things that help us stay human. They help us come back to ourselves. This is good information to have. It means we need to continue to work against toxic masculinity. We need to continue to teach our children to be kind, to educate against bullying. And we should plant more trees. And even if it turns out that the data in the studies was misleading because correlation doesn't mean causation, the world will be lovelier and healthier and kinder and more just. So we might as well. Unfortunately, the cut to funding in 1996 means that the overwhelming conclusion of scientists that study this issue is that they don't have enough data to make recommendations for the best ways to combat or address this epidemic. It is such an important first step that our lawmakers were able to come to a deal in December. They've allocated $25 million, which is a start. I have a lot of hope that approaching this as a public health issue will make a difference. But I am so floored that this was controversial, that it was hard to get through. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed that the Dickey Amendment passed in the first place and stayed in place for 24 years. How many lives were needlessly destroyed because our elected leaders were more impacted by the loss of potential voters, or maybe the loss of NRA funding, than they were by stories of people, including children, killed by guns? For all these years, whatever strategies people come up with that might help address the epidemic, every time we try to talk about common sense gun control, those conversations wind up going nowhere for lack of supportive data. We can talk about universal background checks, banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. We can look at red line laws. We can discuss what is personally my favorite idea, which is requiring gun owners to carry liability insurance. And part of that's because I wonder if the insurance industry might be a more powerful foil to the NRA than our grassroots work. But all of the suggestions go nowhere because we can't point to the evidence that they will be effective. Systemic changes can't be reliably made on anecdotal evidence. There need to be more studies. There needs to be a coherent strategy. There needs to be an iterative process that measures progress. None of these things were possible when there was no money for research. We've been stalled for 24 years in the place of knowing, mostly, that we need to know more. And I don't even have words for how unacceptable that is. In addition to wading through the science that's there, I reached out to my colleagues to see what wisdom they had to share. I didn't get a ton of responses, but I was able to have an in-depth conversation with David Miller, my colleague who serves in Fairfax, Virginia. His church is less than a mile from NRA headquarters. He told me 3 stories that I want to share with you. The first dates back to a time when he actually was in San Diego. He spoke at a gun control event and afterwards made a connection with the owner of a gun store who was there to protest. They agreed to go to lunch together. They had a good conversation. They were finding common ground. And they got some press coverage around this, including a segment on the TV news. At the end of their conversation, they had agreed that they were going to meet again. They were going to meet again and keep the conversation going. But when David called to set up their next meeting, the gun shop owner refused to have any further contact. David's conclusion was that somebody got to him. As he told me the stories, I got chill bumps. Is this the kind of world that we live in, where people who try to build connections and find common ground across difference get got to? David also talked about the way he and members of his congregations and other organizations working on gun violence stand vigil outside the NRA on the 15th of each month. And we know why the 15th, right? That's Sandy Hook. They've also had several larger events, including hosting a March for Life where over 300 clergy gathered in front of the NRA, and a reverse town hall, which was attended by 15 legislators. The event, which included a lot of storytelling and a lot of listening, was incredibly impactful for people on both sides of the aisle. But again, he lamented it didn't go anywhere. Then he shared with me the story of the time gun violence shattered his community, his congregation. Their longtime custodian was shot and killed by her husband, who also killed their pregnant daughter's boyfriend. The husband was well known to the congregation as he did most of their outside work, lawn mowing and leaf blowing and snow shoveling. David shared how difficult it was to process the trauma himself while supporting his folks. And also, in his words, I still had to make sure the lawn got mowed and the bathrooms got cleaned. When he finished telling me this third story, we moved into what was, for me, the most meaningful part of our conversation. We talked about what it's like to do this work, to research and speak and act and organize in response to the epidemic of gun violence when we ourselves carry gun-related trauma in our bodies. And so do the people we serve. At one point, a couple days ago, I came into the sanctuary to meditate. And I looked at the weaving we did on the 1-year anniversary of the shooting. I looked at the mobile that someone sent us in the days immediately following it. 5 years ago. Seems like just yesterday. Seems like forever. I thought about Donald and the way one of the most solid and loving people I know confessed that on the 1-year anniversary of Donald's death, it hit them so hard that they couldn't function. I thought about Henry, who only a few of us knew well enough to grieve. And I thought about Toby, who I never met, but whose ghost lingers here with the others. I thought about Officer Newbill and the other victims of the 2007 mass shooting. I thought about Katie Benoit, who was killed by her ex-lover just a year before I got here. Mostly, though, I thought about all of you. I held you all in my heart, knowing that there are going to be people in this room when I did this that are gun owners, and others who have been gun control advocates and activists for decades. I knew there would be parents who've had to comfort their kids after a day of active shooter drills. I knew that there would be people who were really kind of mad at me for lighting that candle about gun violence every week because they don't want their nose rubbed in it over and over again. All of us carrying the trauma of gun violence in our bodies, all of us needing to ask, what sickness is there, not just out there, but in here, in our community, that we have so many of these stories that we have to hold. It's easy to blame the guns, but it's really hard to ask myself that question because it's not at all abstract or intellectual. Another colleague responded to my request with a link to an article that talked about the root cause of the gun violence epidemic being soul sickness. The shooters, the article argued, are in pain because they don't have a supportive and loving spiritual community. And here I stand in the midst of a supportive and loving spiritual community that did its absolute best to be there for the little boy who grew up to be John Lee. Just as we did our absolute best to be there for Toby and for Henry and for Donald. So I want to say, with no pretense, with no ambiguity, that none of it was your fault. Sometimes depression makes a person feel alone even when they're surrounded by people who love them. Sometimes people's brains betray them and make them see and feel and do things that make no sense. I think sometimes I'll just speak for myself, sometimes I spend my time raking through memories for evidence that I made some mistake. Because as devastating as it is when I find something that I did wrong that contributed to the problem, it's easier than admitting that I'm unable to keep the people I love absolutely safe. The truth is, there's nothing more we could have or should have done. This isn't to say that we shouldn't keep doing all we can to lower the odds. We need to look out for each other. We need to address bullying in the schools, advocate for better mental health support, and for reasonable gun control reforms. We need to plant those trees. Get our kids off their devices and out into nature and into relationship with each other. But we also need to tend to our own spirits so that in the face of violence and inhumanity, we're able to continue to stay human. We're able to continue to stay kind. We need to get better at asking each other for help with the hard things. We need to embody interdependence. We need to keep coming back to the conversation, even though we have the spiritual equivalent of shrapnel still in our bodies. Have any of you watched Bowling for Columbine? Yeah, I watched it again as part of this research. I couldn't get through that in one sitting either. Now, Michael Moore blames the epidemic on the pervasive climate of fear that we live in. Stoked by the media, financially supported by the military-industrial complex, the sense of fear and danger keeps us in a constant state of arousal. And as I said during the meditation, we need to calm down in order to connect and be creative. Fear isolates us, as well as making us incapable of accessing rational thought. And isolation leads to depression and thoughts of harm, self-harm and harm of others. And we are constantly being drenched with fear. Think about the way the media sensationalizes everything. Remember Y2K? Right? Or the bird flu? I had a good friend who was a physician and an admiral in the Navy, and on his advice, as the bird flu was coming to the States, we actually ordered 4 of those $50 masks at one point. Remember the way we were scared to open our mail for a few weeks after somebody found, I think it was ricin in it? Remember Ebola? Right? Then there's the most dangerous piece. The media is working very hard to convince us to be afraid of our neighbors. The partisan divide, the religious divide, the cultural divide, the more we allow ourselves to see the world in black and white, the more we're vulnerable to being manipulated. There are no easy fixes. There are no magic cures to address the gun violence epidemic. What's ahead of us, then, is a long, hard process of gradual change that won't ever completely eliminate the problem. That's real. You know, other countries, they have a lot less gun violence than ours does, but they still have some. I trust scientists to help gather data and chart fact-based strategies to address the epidemic. And I'll continue to do everything in my power to support their efforts. But there's no one better suited than religious communities to do the work of teaching people to calm down, connect, breathe, come back to kindness. That's what we're here for. And in particular, I think there's no one better suited than this religious community. Because we've faced these hard things. We've faced these hard feelings. And it's not easy or smooth. It works like my preparation for the sermon. You know, we lean in for a little while and then we get triggered. We lose our capacity. We have to back away and breathe and soothe. But then we circle back. We circle back. And that's the gift that I found at the end of this struggle. We've come through some really hard stuff, some really tough stuff, and we do carry that trauma in our bodies. and we always will. But when I look out at you, I don't just see the wounds and the scars. I see wisdom, and I see depth, and I see strength and resilience. I see commitment. I see compassion. I see the way these experiences we've come through have forged us into a people of courage and integrity, capable of facing these big, seemingly intractable issues like gun violence, but also oppression and climate change. And we face it directly. I see you responding with such skill and so much grace. And above all, with this limitless love that never fails to lift me up. I see hope when I look at you. So, thank you. Thank you, Pat, for making me do this. And thank you all for being brave warriors of compassion and beloved community. So be it, and so may it be.